My arrival at economics was a bit strange. What attracted me to it is, so there's this expression that economists are worldly philosophers, right? Like we're concerned with the material world in a way that philosophers can't be bothered with. And really reading through the history of how we came to think about economics as like profit is evil all the way to capitalism, and that evolution was really compelling to me. And then, so with that kind of more philosophical backing, I loaded on all the math I needed to survive a PhD, and came out here. And really, a lot of what I do today is bringing that historical basis into kind of a more practical day-to-day labor economics. I kind of see it as like a layer cake sort of situation where there's kind of material, problems. There's exposures that happen at a workplace that result in injuries or illnesses, right? And for me, at my level of analysis, a lot of that comes out in the wash. What I am doing is kind of a bit more remote level, which in some ways makes it less actionable, of looking at the way that we organize economic activity and how that leads to injuries and illnesses. With that different perspective, it's been very interesting seeing people who are very much in the nitty-gritty of it, looking at particular exposures in a very detailed way, and it really fills in a lot of what was more amorphous in my own research agenda. A lot of that's personal. I grew up working class family. My dad was a framing carpenter. My grandfather was a framing carpenter. My mother's a home health aide, right? These are jobs with some very high injury burdens. And I mean, I saw that my grandfather, for instance, he worked for 25 years for the same company, non-union residential construction in the state of Oklahoma. And at the end of it, he had a stroke and couldn't work anymore. And when that was all said and done, he didn't have anything to show for it, right? He had Social Security for retirement, and that was about it. And, disability once he couldn't work. And so seeing the ways in which that job hampered him physically, but also economically later in his life, so that whenever he was, in his 60s and almost in his 70s, he didn't really get a retirement. And likewise, my dad really struggles with a lot of physical issues from his job, as does my mother, and so it's really kind of one of those things where we're viewing. I'm really interested in job quality as this holistic thing because there is a human element to it as well as just what is your wage rate. My dissertation advisor, Peter Phillips, he's an economist who really focuses on construction issues. And near the tail end of my PhD, I was brought in on a project with him that really deals with injuries and illnesses in the construction industry, but looking at it from an economic perspective, where we're really looking at business practices. So if a firm decides to subcontract out a lot of work, they might also be trying to offload a lot of risky tasks that might get someone injured, right? And so we're looking at a bunch of government data that talks about subcontracting construction to see how that might relate to injuries. And so I was brought in on that project, and Peter knew some people here and made me aware of RMCOEH, and that's kind of how I ended up here. I've got a few irons in the fire. The one I've spent the most time on lately is a paper on local trucking. So basically trucking that's within a state, not between states. And there's a lot of work that exists there already on how whenever you pay truckers less, they tend to drive faster and longer, try to stretch the hours of service regulations, and as a consequence, they tend to have more accidents, get hurt, people, just members of the public get hurt, right? But there's not a lot of work talking about why pay might be low in the industry. I'm looking at how we can trace monopsony power of employers and states to lower wages and then to injuries, kind of sequentially, to kind of fill in the gaps between the two. I definitely want to take on some bigger projects here that can take a bit of a longer trajectory, but eventually I'd like to end up at some sort of research center or a faculty position somewhere. Academia certainly has its appeals. I like teaching, so it'd be great to have a job that combines both the research aspects and the teaching aspects. But honestly, I just want to do work that I feel is important and that has some sort of, can move the needle policy-wise a little bit.